The billionaire's hand froze mid-signature. Frank Cole had fired 17 employees that month without blinking. He had destroyed competitors, crushed negotiations, and earned his reputation as the man without a heart. But now, staring at the security footage on his laptop, he couldn't breathe. The new maid was wiping down his kitchen counter. Nothing unusual, except for the ring on her finger. Not diamond, not gold. Just a crude copper wire wrapped around a piece of blue glass. A ring he had made with his own hands 20 years ago in an orphanage for a girl he had promised to marry. Frank Cole owned half of the East Coast's most valuable real estate. His penthouse overlooked Manhattan, his name commanded respect in every boardroom, and his net worth exceeded what most people could imagine in 10 lifetimes. Yet he couldn't sleep. Every night he lay in his California king bed surrounded by Egyptian cotton sheets and absolute silence, staring at the ceiling until dawn crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His doctor prescribed pills. His therapist suggested meditation. Nothing worked. Control. That was what Frank needed. Control over every aspect of his life, down to the temperature of his coffee and the angle of his desk lamp. That was why he had fired his entire household staff 3 weeks ago. One of them had leaked information to a tabloid. He never found out which one, so he eliminated all of them. His assistant, a nervous young man named David, had presented him with a stack of applications for a new housekeeper. "I need someone who doesn't exist," Frank had said, not looking up from his documents. "Someone who won't talk, won't ask questions, won't try to become my friend. Someone invisible." David had found exactly that. Natalie Wright, 36 years old. 15 years of experience working for Manhattan's elite families. Not a single complaint in her file. Not a single employer who remembered her face. Perfect. Natalie arrived on a Tuesday morning carrying a small bag and wearing a simple gray dress. Frank didn't greet her. He had David show her to the staff quarters and explain the rules. No conversation unless addressed, no presence in rooms he occupied, no personal effects in common areas. She nodded once and began working. For the first week, Frank barely noticed her. She moved through his penthouse like a ghost, cleaning surfaces he didn't know were dirty, organizing spaces he had forgotten existed. He would enter a room and find it transformed, though he could never pinpoint exactly what had changed. The lighting seemed softer somehow. The air carried a faint scent he couldn't identify but found oddly comforting. His meals appeared at precise intervals, simple dishes that reminded him of something he couldn't name. On the 8th night, Frank Cole slept for 6 uninterrupted hours. He woke up confused, almost alarmed. He couldn't remember the last time that had happened. His body felt strange lighter, as if some weight he had been carrying had temporarily lifted. He told himself it was coincidence. But then it happened again, and again. By the 3rd week, Frank found himself curious about the woman who had somehow altered the atmosphere of his home without changing anything visible. He began checking the security cameras, not out of suspicion but out of fascination. He watched her work. She moved with quiet efficiency, never rushing, never wasting motion. She talked to no one, hummed no songs, displayed no personality whatsoever. Except for one thing: the ring. She wore it constantly, that crude copper band with the blue glass stone. She never took it off, not when washing dishes, not when scrubbing floors, not when her hands were buried in soapy water. It was clearly worthless, the kind of thing a child might make as a craft project. Yet she protected it like it was the most precious thing she owned. Frank first noticed it on a Thursday evening. He was reviewing footage from earlier that day, watching Natalie dust his study when the camera caught the ring in clear detail. His coffee cup slipped from his fingers. The copper wire was twisted in a specific pattern, 3 loops crossing over each other before wrapping around the stone. The blue glass was cut at an odd angle, one corner chipped slightly. He knew that pattern. He knew that chip. He had made them himself 20 years ago in the basement of St. Catherine's Orphanage in Baltimore. Frank closed his laptop, opened it, closed it again. His hands were shaking. St. Catherine's. He hadn't allowed himself to think about that place in 2 decades. He had paid good money to erase every connection to it, changed his name, when the Morrisons adopted him, built an entirely new identity from scratch. But now the memories came flooding back unstoppable. The cramped dormitory rooms, the smell of industrial cleaner and overcooked vegetables, the older boys who stole food from the younger ones, the nights spent hungry and afraid, and her, Natalie. She had been 14 to his 16, small for her age, with eyes that seemed too old for her face. The other children picked on her constantly. She was different, quiet, and easy target. Frank had protected her. Not because he was brave, but because protecting her made him feel like he mattered, like he was worth something. They had become inseparable. She would save half her bread for him when he got in trouble and missed meals. He would stand between her and anyone who tried to hurt her. At night, they would sit on the fire escape and talk about the future, about escape, about a life beyond those walls. One winter night, Frank had found a piece of copper wire in the maintenance room and a shard of blue glass from a broken bottle. He had spent hours twisting and shaping them, cutting his fingers on the sharp edges, until he had something that vaguely resembled a ring. He had given it to her on Christmas Eve, the only gift either of them received that year. "When I get rich," he had said, his voice cracking with adolescent sincerity, "I'll come back for you. I'll marry you. Keep this as proof." She had smiled, and he had felt like the wealthiest person in the world. 2 weeks later, the Morrisons came. They were wealthy, connected, everything Frank had dreamed about. They wanted to adopt him, give him their name, pay for his education, open every door that had been closed to him. There was only one condition: complete separation from your past. Mr. Morrison had explained, his tone businesslike. No contact with anyone from the orphanage. No mention of where you came from. You will be Frank Morrison, born into our family. The boy from St. Catherine's will cease to exist. Frank had hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. Then he had agreed. He didn't say goodbye to Natalie. He told himself he would find a way to contact her later, that he would keep his promise somehow. But the Morrisons were thorough. They moved him to Connecticut, immediately enrolled him in a private school, surrounded him with new friends and new expectations. And slowly, deliberately, Frank allowed himself to forget. When he turned 21, he changed his last name from Morrison to Cole. The Morrisons had given him everything, but their name felt like a collar around his neck, a constant reminder that he belonged to someone else. Cole was neutral, untraceable, entirely his own. It was the final step in burying the boy from St. Catherine's forever. He built his empire alone, trusting no one, needing no one. He told himself the past was dead, but now, staring at the security footage of a woman wearing a copper ring with blue glass, Frank realized the past had never left. It had been waiting for him. He could confront her, walk into the kitchen right now and ask if she was the girl from St. Catherine's. But that would mean admitting who he really was. That would mean facing the promise he had broken, the person he had abandoned. Frank Cole had destroyed companies. He had bankrupted rivals. He had looked into the eyes of powerful men and watched them crumble. But he could not bring himself to face one woman with a copper ring. So he made a different choice. He would test her. He would leave clues, triggers, things that only someone from St. Catherine's would recognize. He would watch her reactions and gather evidence. And then, only then, would he decide what to do. It wasn't courage. Frank knew that. It was cowardice dressed up as strategy. But it was all he could manage. The first test came 3 days later. Frank placed a blue glass bottle on the kitchen counter before leaving for work. It was the same shade of blue as the shard he had used to make the ring, the kind of cheap glass that factories produced by the millions, but that meant everything to 2 orphans who had nothing. He watched the footage that evening, rewinding and pausing obsessively. Natalie had entered the kitchen at 7:15 in the morning. She had wiped down the counters, organized the fruit bowl, and then her hand had stopped inches from the bottle. For exactly 4 seconds, she didn't move. Then she picked it up carefully, almost tenderly, and placed it in the cabinet with the other glassware. Her face betrayed nothing. But those 4 seconds told Frank everything he needed to know. She recognized it. The second test was more specific. Frank found a recording of Silent Night, performed by a children's choir, the same version that St. Catherine's had played every Christmas. He set it as his morning alarm, loud enough to be heard throughout the penthouse. He pretended to sleep in that day, watching through the security cameras as Natalie moved through her duties. When the music started, she was dusting the bookshelves in his study. Her hand slowed against the wood. Her eyes drifted toward the window, unfocused, seeing something far beyond the Manhattan skyline. She stood there for nearly a minute, cloth frozen in mid-motion. Then she blinked, straightened her shoulders, and continued working as if nothing had happened. Frank felt something twist in his chest. It might have been guilt. It might have been hope. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. The third test was the most dangerous. He had kept one photograph from St. Catherine's hidden in a safe deposit box for 20 years. It showed a group of children standing in front of the orphanage's main building, squinting against the winter sun. Frank was in the back row, skinny and serious. Natalie stood 3 rows ahead, barely visible, her face half turned toward the camera. He left the photograph on his desk face up, as if he had been looking at it and forgotten to put it away. That afternoon, he came home early and hid in his bedroom, watching the live feed on his phone. Natalie entered the study at 4:30 to empty the wastebasket. She noticed the photograph immediately. Her whole body went still, the kind of stillness that spoke louder than any scream. She picked up the photograph with both hands, holding it like it might crumble to dust. Her thumb traced across the faces of children long grown, stopping at 2 points that Frank knew without seeing. Him and her. She stood there for a long time, longer than he had expected. When she finally set the photograph down, she placed it exactly where she had found it, aligned perfectly with the edge of the desk. Then she finished emptying the wastebasket and left the room. She never mentioned it, never asked about it, never gave any indication that the photograph existed. And that restraint, that absolute commitment to remaining invisible, broke something inside Frank. She knew who he was. She had probably known from the moment she took this job, yet she had said nothing, demanded nothing, expected nothing. She was still protecting him just as she had done when they were children, protecting him from the confrontation he was too cowardly to initiate. The distance between them became unbearable. Every morning, Frank found reasons to be in the kitchen when Natalie arrived. He would linger over his coffee, pretending to read the newspaper, stealing glances at her as she moved through her tasks. She acknowledged him with polite nods, and nothing more, maintaining the wall between employer and employee with perfect precision. He wanted to tear that wall down. He wanted to grab her shoulders and demand answers. He wanted to fall at her feet and beg forgiveness. Instead, he asked her to refill his coffee cup and watched her walk away. The charity gala had been planned for months. Frank hated these events, the forced smiles and hollow conversations, the wealthy pretending to care about causes they couldn't even name. But his publicist insisted. After the staff firings had made headlines, he needed to rehabilitate his image. Philanthropist Frank Cole hosts Evening of Giving, the invitation read. 300 guests at $5,000 a plate, all proceeds going to underprivileged youth programs. The irony was not lost on him. He had ordered Natalie to stay in the staff quarters during the event. The last thing he needed was distraction, and her presence had become exactly that. But on the night of the gala, his catering manager approached him with a problem. "We're short-staffed, Mr. Cole. 3 servers called in sick. We need everyone available." Frank should have refused. He should have hired replacements or reduced the service. Instead, he heard himself saying, "Use whoever you have, including my housekeeper." He told himself it was a practical decision. He told himself it had nothing to do with wanting to see her in his world, even for one night. Natalie appeared an hour into the event wearing a simple black dress that the catering company had provided. She carried a tray of champagne glasses through the crowd, eyes down movements efficient. No one noticed her. That was her gift, her curse, her survival mechanism. She could walk through a room full of people and leave no impression whatsoever, but Frank noticed. He tracked her across the ballroom like a compass pointing north, unable to look away for more than a few seconds at a time. That was when Victoria Ashford decided to make trouble. Victoria was old money, the kind of wealth that had been inherited so many times it felt like a birthright, rather than a fortune. She had approached Frank 6 months ago with a business proposal that he had rejected, and she had been nursing the grudge ever since. She spotted Natalie passing nearby and called out, her voice sharp with champagne and contempt. "You there with the tray? Come here." Natalie stopped and turned her face neutral. Victoria grabbed Natalie's hand and held it up for her companions to see. "Ladies, look at this. The help is wearing jewelry. And what jewelry it is. Is this copper? Is that glass?" Laughter rippled through the group. Victoria yanked the ring off Natalie's finger in one swift motion. "Let me do you a favor and throw this away. You'll never find a husband wearing garbage like this." She tossed the ring carelessly over her shoulder. It hit the marble floor with a small sound that somehow cut through all the noise of the gala, bouncing twice before rolling under a nearby table. Natalie dropped to her knees immediately, her tray clattering to the ground, champagne glasses shattering around her. She crawled toward the table, searching desperately, her composure finally broken. Victoria laughed. "Look at her scrambling on the floor like an animal." Frank was already moving. The crowd parted for him instinctively. They always did. But this time there was something in his expression that made people step back further than usual, something dangerous that they had never seen from the composed billionaire. He walked past Victoria without acknowledging her existence. He walked past the staring guests, the whispered comments, the raised phones capturing every moment. He walked directly to where Natalie was still searching under the table, and he knelt down beside her on the cold marble floor. The ring had rolled against the far table leg. Frank picked it up carefully, feeling the familiar weight of copper and glass in his palm. 20 years, and it still felt exactly as he remembered. Natalie was staring at him, her eyes wide, her breath uneven. This close, he could see the tears she was fighting to hold back. Frank took her hand gently. He slid the ring back onto her finger, the same finger where he had placed it 2 decades ago in the basement of St. Catherine's. Then he stood and turned to face Victoria Ashford. The ballroom had gone completely silent. 300 of Manhattan's wealthiest citizens stood frozen champagne glasses halfway to their lips, watching the most powerful man in the room defend his housekeeper. "This ring," Frank said, his voice carrying across the silence, "is worth more than every diamond in this room combined, and you just insulted the woman wearing it in front of me." Victoria's face had gone pale. "Frank, I didn't mean, get out of my home, and don't expect any future invitations to anything bearing my name." Victoria gathered her clutch and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking loudly in the silence. No one moved to follow her. No one moved at all. Frank turned back to Natalie and offered his hand to help her up. She took it hesitantly, rising from the floor with as much dignity as she could manage. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, for her ears only. "I should have stopped her sooner." Natalie looked at him for a long moment. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement of everything that had been left unsaid for 20 years. Then she pulled her hand away, picked up her tray, and walked toward the kitchen. The gala continued, but Frank barely noticed. He spent the rest of the evening going through the motions, shaking hands and making small talk, while his mind replayed that moment over and over. He had knelt for her, in front of everyone. The billionaire who never showed weakness, who never let anyone see him as anything less than invincible. He had knelt on a dirty floor to retrieve a copper ring worth nothing, and he would do it again in a heartbeat. Natalie was gone by morning. Frank found the letter on his desk, placed exactly where the photograph had been. The handwriting was careful, each letter precisely formed. Frank, I did not come here for money. I did not come to demand the promise you made 20 years ago. I came because after all this time, I needed to know what kind of man you had become. I needed to see if the boy who protected me in that orphanage still existed somewhere inside the billionaire everyone fears. Now I know. What you did tonight was more than I ever expected, more than I had any right to hope for. You defended me when it cost you nothing, and that kindness is enough to last me the rest of my life. But I cannot stay. Not because you left me behind all those years ago. I made peace with that long before I walked through your door. You were 16 and scared, and someone offered you everything you had ever wanted. I would have done the same thing. I cannot stay because if I do, I will become the woman who waits, the woman who hopes, the woman who builds her life around someone else's choices. I spent 20 years learning not to be that woman. I will not unlearn it now. The ring you gave me is the only proof that someone once loved me enough to make a promise. It does not matter that the promise was broken. It matters that it was made. Thank you for kneeling. Thank you for remembering. Please do not look for me. Natalie. Frank read the letter 7 times. Then he sat in his empty penthouse surrounded by everything money could buy and felt the full weight of his own cowardice crushing him. He had known where she was for 5 years. He had hired private investigators when his empire was secure enough to risk someone digging into his past. They had found her easily enough working as a housekeeper in Brooklyn, living alone in a small apartment, still wearing the ring he had made. He could have gone to her at any time. He had the resources, the power, the freedom. Nothing was stopping him except his own fear. Fear that she would reject him. Fear that she would forgive him. Fear that either outcome would force him to acknowledge what he had done, the person he had abandoned, the promise he had broken. So he had done nothing. He had watched from a distance, monitoring her life through reports and photographs, telling himself that knowing she was okay was enough. It wasn't enough. It had never been enough. And now she was gone again, and this time it was entirely his fault. Frank had built his fortune on the principle that every problem had a solution. Every obstacle could be overcome. Every battle could be won with enough resources and determination. But he couldn't buy back 20 years of silence. He couldn't negotiate his way out of cowardice. He couldn't acquire the courage he had never possessed. Natalie's letter sat on his desk, and Frank realized he was crying for the first time since he was 16 years old, standing in the driveway of the Morrison estate, watching the life he had known disappear in a rearview mirror. He had everything, and he had nothing at all. 3 days passed. Frank did not go to work. He did not answer calls from his assistant or respond to urgent emails from his board of directors. He sat in his penthouse and read Natalie's letter until he had memorized every word, every curve of her handwriting, every space between the lines. She had asked him not to look for her. He had spent 20 years not looking for her, and it had made him into a man he despised. On the 4th morning, Frank put on an old jacket he hadn't worn in years, left his phone on the kitchen counter, and drove to Baltimore. The address was still in his files, the same apartment she had lived in when his investigators found her 5 years ago. A small building in a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where people minded their own business and didn't ask questions. Frank parked across the street and sat in his car for nearly an hour watching the entrance. He had faced hostile boardrooms and cutthroat negotiations without flinching. But the thought of walking up those stairs terrified him more than anything he had ever encountered. Finally, he forced himself out of the car. The building had no elevator. He climbed 4 flights of stairs, each step heavier than the last. When he reached her door, he stood there for a long moment, his hand raised to knock his courage failing him. Then he thought about the copper ring, the photograph, the 4 seconds she had frozen when she saw the blue glass bottle. She had carried his memory for 20 years. The least he could do was face her. He knocked. The door opened, and Natalie stood before him in a simple sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back, the copper ring still on her finger. She looked at him without surprise, as if she had been expecting this moment since the night she left. "You found me," she said. Frank swallowed hard. "I always knew where you were." Something flickered in her eyes, but she didn't respond. 5 years ago, he continued, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I hired someone to find all the children from St. Catherine's. I told myself I was just curious, that I wanted to know what happened to everyone. But really, I was looking for you." Natalie leaned against the door frame, her arms crossed. "And when you found me, I did nothing." Frank felt the shame burning in his chest. "I knew where you lived, where you worked. I knew you still wore the ring. And I did nothing because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid you would look at me and see what I really am. A coward who made a promise to a 14-year-old girl and then disappeared without even saying goodbye." Natalie was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "Why are you here now, Frank?" He had rehearsed answers to this question during the entire drive from Manhattan. Explanations, justifications, carefully constructed arguments. But standing in front of her, all of those words dissolved into nothing. "Because I don't want to be a coward anymore," he said simply. "Not for one more day." Natalie studied his face, searching for something. Whatever she found made her step back from the doorway. "Come in." Her apartment was small but clean, filled with second-hand furniture and potted plants that crowded every available surface. Frank felt oversized and out of place, his expensive jacket absurd against the modest surroundings. Natalie sat on a worn armchair and gestured for him to take the couch across from her. The distance between them felt both too close and impossibly far. "You were right to leave," Frank said before she could speak. "Everything in your letter was right. I had 20 years to find you, and I chose not to. I had the money, the power, the freedom. Nothing was stopping me except my own fear." Natalie's expression didn't change. "And now? Now I understand something I should have understood a long time ago." Frank leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "When I was 16, I thought leaving was the brave choice. I thought I was being smart, taking the opportunity, building a better future. But I wasn't brave. I was just scared of being poor and forgotten. So I traded everything real for everything shiny, and I've been empty ever since." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Inside was a coil of copper wire and a pair of small pliers. "I'm not here to ask you to forgive me," he said, placing the bundle on the coffee table between them. "I'm not here to make promises I might not keep. I'm just here to tell you that I want to try again. Not as a billionaire and a housekeeper. Just as two people who knew each other before the world told us we couldn't be together." Natalie looked at the copper wire, then back at Frank. "What are you asking for?" "A chance to make another ring," he said. "Not because the first one wasn't enough, but because I want you to have something made by the man I am now, not just the boy I used to be." For the first time since he had arrived, Natalie's composure cracked. Her eyes glistened, and she pressed her lips together as if holding back words that had been waiting 20 years to escape. "Do you know what kept me going all those years?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "It wasn't the promise. I stopped believing in the promise a long time ago." Frank waited, afraid to breathe. "The night you made that ring, you cut your hand on the glass. You were bleeding and you didn't have anything to bandage it with. So I tore a strip from my shirt and wrapped it around your fingers." Natalie touched the copper ring on her hand. "That was when I knew you were different. You were willing to hurt yourself to give me something beautiful. No one had ever done that for me before." She met his eyes. "I kept the ring because it reminded me that I was worth bleeding for. Even if you forgot. Even if you never came back. Someone once thought I was worth that much." Frank felt tears sliding down his face. He didn't try to wipe them away. "I never forgot," he whispered. "Not one day. I just convinced myself that forgetting was easier than facing what I'd done. Natalie rose from her chair and crossed the small distance between them. She sat beside him on the couch close enough that he could smell the familiar scent that had filled his penthouse during those weeks she worked there. "I don't need promises," she said quietly. "I don't need rings or apologies or explanations. I just need to know that you're here because you want to be, not because you feel guilty." Frank took her hand, the one wearing the copper ring, and held it gently. "I'm here because for 20 years I've been building an empire to prove I was worth something. And the whole time, the only thing that ever made me feel worth anything was a girl who tore her shirt to bandage my hand." Natalie smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her since they were teenagers on a fire escape dreaming of escape. "Then stay," she said, "and we'll figure out the rest together." The seasons changed, and so did they. Natalie moved into Frank's penthouse, but she brought her world with her. The potted plants from her apartment now lined the windows. The second-hand books filled his empty shelves. She still cooked their meals herself, still wore simple clothes, still refused to let him buy her anything she didn't need. Frank learned to live at her pace. He delegated more responsibilities to his team, left the office before sunset, spent evenings sitting with her on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker on below them. On her finger, Natalie now wore 2 rings. The original copper band with its blue glass stone worn smooth by 20 years of constant wear. And beside it, a new ring that Frank had made himself, the copper wire twisted clumsily, the craftsmanship far from perfect. He had cut his hand, making it just like the first time. Natalie had bandaged it with a strip torn from one of his expensive dress shirts, and they had both laughed until they cried. One evening, as the sun painted the Manhattan skyline in shades of orange and gold, Natalie asked him a question. "Do you regret it?" "The 20 years," Frank considered carefully before answering. "I regret every day I stayed away," he said, "but I don't wish I could change it." "Why not?" "Because if I had come back when I was 18 or 25 or 30, I would still have been the coward who left. I needed all those years to become someone worthy of sitting next to you." Natalie leaned her head against his shoulder. "You're still not worthy." Frank smiled. "I know. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be." The copper rings caught the last light of the setting sun, and for a moment they glowed like something precious. Because they were. Some promises are born in poverty, made by children who have nothing but hope. Most of those promises break under the weight of time and circumstance. But the ones that survive, the ones that find their way back after 20 years of silence, those are the promises that matter most. Not because they were kept, but because someone remembered. If this story touched your heart, I'd love for you to subscribe and join our community. We share stories like this every week, stories about love loss and the courage it takes to find our way back to the people who matter. And I'm curious, have you ever made a promise you couldn't keep? Or maybe someone made a promise to you that they broke. How did you find peace with it? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is know we're not alone. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.